Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a topic about the incoming administration of Donald Trump and its foreign economic policy toward China, which has global ramifications. Let me point out that the Trump administration has a record. It was in office for 4 years, from 2017 to 2021. It does have a record on foreign economic policy, and that record was unilateral trade policy, which in many respects reflected the sort of quasi unilateral foreign policy in the geopolitical realm. So the geoeconomic and geopolitical um, policies of neo-isolationism have some convergence in that respect. There have been many articles that also have on the incoming administration's um, possible policies toward China, based on what has been said by the man himself, the president-elect, as well as people around him, people slated to be either in positions of trade, commerce, treasury, as well as national security positions from State Department to National Security Advisor and various other advisors on foreign economic policy. The question, of course, is the incoming administration's policy going to be deviating that far from that of Biden? We do know Biden his term is over almost. He has a record. We do know that his policy toward China was just as austere, just as rigorous against China, tilting toward economic nationalism. In fact, he accepted many of the assumptions of Trump administration people when Trump was in office about how to contain China economically. The question is, did any of this work? And this is a question that individual scholars have raised in scholarly articles that they have written, as well as large news organizations like Bloomberg, as well as private entities, investment firms like Goldman Sachs, and so forth. So everybody has a right to ask the question, okay, you want to pursue this policy. Toward what end? Will it achieve the goals that you state? This is a legitimate question. Let me begin by stating that economic nationalism as a theory became popular in the 19th century. One of the most famous classic economic theorists was the German Friedrich List. He opposed Adam Smith's laissez-faire economics. He believed that laissez-faire economics favored countries that were already industrialized, like England. So he argued that laissez-faire economics always favors the entity that is ahead of the others, so the terms of trade are uneven. So in economic theory, one of the things we must consider is the terms of trade. This is a key question. Uh, Under laissez-faire, when you have a country, let's not come to the present, but you can take a country, although in the present we'll do that too with China versus the world. You can take a country like England in the late 18th, early 19th century, which was so far way ahead of everyone else because it was the first country in the world to industrialize, that no one else could compete. So, rightly, they, of course, favored the laissez faire free trade. They didn't want tariff restrictions. They didn't want anyone to put tariff restrictions on them. And they were not concerned about tariffs themselves because they could easily outcompete everyone. While in theory, Friedrich List pointed out, the German economist pointed out, it all sounds great because the wealth of the nations, as the title of Adam Smith's book goes, um, advances. In practice, he maintained there is a dependence of the lesser industrialized and the unindustrialized countries on the industrialized one, because that one, or two or three in the 20th century, of course, have the advantage over the other one, and therefore they determine the means of trade. And besides, value added products, as we know, historically cost more than raw materials. So the raw materials exporting country is at a disadvantage when it comes to terms of trade versus the country exporting value added products. So the United States, let's go to the US since we this is the topic of today. The United States in the 19th century was one of the most protectionist countries in the Western world. And it was protectionist um, because it wanted to industrialize. It was competing with the mother country, Great Britain, and Western Europe. So, in order to industrialize, it had to protect the embryonic industries and shops here at home, and so they were adopting a tariff regime to make sure that the consumer buys domestic, not foreign. So by making the foreign product expensive, the consumer is forced to buy domestic, pay more for it, and perhaps lower quality. But then the long term benefit is that the country develops, industrializes, it becomes self sufficient, and theoretically speaking, though this is not the reality is a little bit more nuanced. Um, Theoretically speaking, you develop a working class, a thriving working class, and a middle class. And so, presumably, all of society advances and the productivity of society advances in this fashion. Now, why would a country, though, like the United States, which is industrialized, go back to the 19th century of tariff regime, um, as well as sanctions? By the way, let's face it, the U.S. is has been very liberal with its sanctions for all sorts of reasons, mostly geopolitical reasons, obviously, national in the name of national security. But why go to economic nationalism, something that was practiced in the 19th and early 20th century, I should add, by the way, um, when the US is already industrialized? The reason, the other reason that countries go toward economic nationalism is because they are concerned someone else who has already advanced ahead of them, okay? In this case, China, the world's number one manufacturing country today, and the world's number one economy in GDP measured in purchasing power parity terms, roughly 7 trillion ahead of the United States. Yes. And a country which is, by the way, just for the record, because the incoming administration obviously has all kinds of uh, hyperbole, hyperbolic rhetoric regarding how it will defeat China. Just for the record, China is the world's number one trading partner. It's the number two trading partner for Europe, Latin America, and Canada, and the US. The US, it's number three, right? Sorry. For the US, it's number three. For Latin America, Europe, Canada, it's number two. For the global south, for Eurasia, for Russia, um, for Australia, for the vast majority of this planet, China is the world's number one trading partner, not the United States. And Latin America, where China ranks this number two, by the way, behind the United States, is rapidly moving toward China because of the BRICS group. Just yesterday, I believe, or the day before, um, the president of China, Xi Jinping, signed a major deal with the government of Peru to build one of the largest seaports in Peru, which would be at the gateway for the Western Hemisphere. And just for the record, by the way, China has control of most of the ports in the world, commercial ports, merchant marine ports in the world. Okay. So China is, in fact, way ahead. This then explains the Trump administrations, as well as Biden, by the way. The policies were not that different from during the Biden period. The administration's insistence that the way to combat that is economic nationalism, tariffs, sanctions, not just against China, but punishing third countries doing business with China and re-exporting to the United States, making their products in China and re-exporting to the United States. The Trump administration has announced, we don't know, they have said they will do this, and we have to take their word for it. And the government in Beijing has argued that they do take their word for it, that these people will go through with this, because when you look at the individuals they have chosen for a number of key positions, from trade and commerce to national security to State Department to even the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and number national security advisor, all of these people, one after another, they have one thing in common: defense. The individual, the Fox News anchor who's slated to be the defense um, secretary, one after another have one thing in common: they're anti-Chinese. They're against China, not necessarily anti-Russia, anti-China. So if we take their word for it, then they will do what they say, which is a very rigorous tariff regime. 60%, by the way, they have proposed. We have to wait and see what the percentages are. But they will also go after countries, including US companies, by the way, that re-export back. So the rhetoric is right now is very harsh, that the United States incoming administration will adopt punitive measures to stop China. Why are they doing this? They have several reasons, they argue. One is jobs. In my lifetime, I have heard this many times. Um, and I have studied it since I have spent decades studying and writing about economic history and international political economy. It's always jobs, when in fact it is not. It is about capital accumulation, it's about capital concentration, it's about the fact that the neoliberal political economy right now is in crisis. It's in serious crisis. So, economic nationalism, unilateral foreign trade policy, congruently with a unilateral geopolitical approach to foreign policy that Trump is planning to adopt, as we saw in the first term, in the first 4 years that he was president, when he got elected the first time in 2016. That is a reflection of the neoliberal crisis and the fact that the government of the United States under Trump, and Biden was not that different, by the way, is looking to see where it can get um, money to strengthen national capitalism, and does not, and has even threatened companies, not just those operating in China, but even, let me give you one example, and I'll come back to this. John Deere, the tractor manufacturer, world household name in the United States and worldwide known all over the world, it has threatened them with at least 100% tariffs if they move the plant operations down in Mexico and re-export up to the U.S. And why did they say that? Well, jobs. Um, well, there is also the argument of national security. We want to have a strong national economy, collect the taxes you got everybody from sales of the products to the workers, to the employees' taxes. They pay taxes to the federal government and the state government. So the government benefits, obviously, and it is in the interest of national security to have that kind of control at home and not to offshore, but to reshore, to bring back. So national labor that is good paying jobs is one argument. National security is the other argument. There is also another issue: the reality that the United States has been unable to compete with China. And if we just take the period from the time that Trump got elected in 2016 until today, the US public debt, despite economic nationalism in quasi terms, I wouldn't say the US has been pursuing economic nationalism full-fledged as Trump is promising to do. But there have been very aggressive policies to go after specific companies like Huawei, for example, the communications company, the Chinese communications company, to go after TikTok, uh, all right, to go after the semiconductor sector, to go after entire sectors, to go after pharmaceutical sectors. There have been such efforts, and yet the US public debt has nearly doubled from the time Trump was elected in 2016, in November, until today. Now, the question is, if economic nationalism is such a success, why has the US public debt, doubled almost? And it is expected to go even higher, by the way. Okay? Because inflationary pressures are inevitable. They're inevitable. Tariffs under a tariff regime, under economic nationalism. Economic nationalism means that prices are going to go higher. So tariffs are a subsidy. they are a form, a subsidy, a way to subsidize the domestic producer, by the way. So we have here a situation where the US government is looking to subsidize domestic producers and to make sure that the US retains the edge because there is a correlation between economic strength and military strength. So now we come to the convergence between economic power and military power. The US was at the zenith of its power in 1945 when it enjoyed that kind of power, that kind of convergence between economic and um, military power. Up until 1949, the US was the only country in the world that had the bomb, for example, okay, the atomic bomb. After 49, the Soviets had it. Now, the fact is that the US has gradually been losing that edge. And it has been losing it under a political economy model that it adopted under Reagan, namely neoliberalism, which means privatize public assets. And we'll talk how much of that Trump insists on doing even more of that. Deregulating, Trump wants more deregulation. Um, Corporate subsidies, corporate welfare state at the expense of the social welfare state. So the continuation of class war against the working class. If you look at statistics from the US Department of Labor, where living standards are for the working class and the middle class in America in 1980, and then in 2023, what you will find is a steady downward trend. Neoliberalism has been a resounding failure for the middle class and the working class, a resounding success for the richest 1%, which owns more wealth in America than the bottom 90% of the population. They're doing fine. Okay? Now, it just so happens that that richest 1%, made a lot of its money in the last 40 years in China, either in direct foreign investment or in portfolio investment. China has been key to many multinational corporations, not just in the US, but all over the world. Imagine Apple or Microsoft or Walmart without China. You can't imagine any of them without China. China has been a catalyst to their success. So economic warfare on them comes right back to the US. And the question is, what is driving this? Is it ideology? Is it nationalist ideology for the sake of hegemony that will never be realized because the genie is out of the bottle? China is already the world's largest economy and the world's #1 trading partner, not the United States, by the way. Can China be contained through economic nationalism? That's the key question. That is the key question. Let me point out that the US-led G7 have decided that neoliberalism, the neoliberal model, also known as the Washington Consensus, for a lot of you, by the way, who have studied neoliberalism, for many, although the Washington Consensus has withered away now, the Washington Consensus has failed the West. It has actually served China much more. Although China has a communist party that's in charge of the government, it's one-party state, it never fully embraced neoliberalism. It used neoliberalism to its advantage in around the world to make enormous gains, gain market share, sell their products during the export-oriented growth strategy that they were pursuing for decades, with double-digit growth, GDP growth, by the way, versus single-digit for many Western countries. But they did not at home pursue a pure neoliberal regime. So one of the concerns of the United States from Obama, actually from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden and now Trump again, has been the industrial policy of China, which is quasi-statist. That is, the state has a huge role in managing the economy, guiding the economy, and globally managing China's economic integration with the world through the Belt and Road Initiative. It just, like I said, just yesterday or the day before, they signed a major deal for a port in Peru at a conference down in Peru, by the way, where Biden, I understand, he will be attending as well. I don't know what he has to offer. He's the outgoing president, and there's another one coming in. But this is a conference on for Pacific Ocean countries, Pacific conference, economic conference. But he just before that, he signed another major deal with Indonesia, a multi-billion-dollar deal with Indonesia. So China is constantly integrating with the world, okay, pursuing economic integration for the sake of maintaining its economic dominance in the world. The US doesn't have that card to play, so it plays a different card. It plays the geopolitical card because the US is the number one military power in the world and spends more money than than the next 10 countries combined. So the US uses its geopolitical leverage. And it uses geopolitical leverage for geoeconomic reasons. However, countries are opting for development, both economic and social development. This is one of the reasons that the BRICS group, where China is dominant in that group, by the way, it's also India, very large economy and continuing to grow very rapidly. It's Russia, it's Brazil, it's South Africa, but China is the largest economy in that group. Okay. And that group poses, along with China, poses a threat. And here is where we get the West frightened, and the G7, actually, which includes Japan, of course, frightened about what China is doing. And we get finally the admission that neoliberalism hasn't worked. So, containment militarism, tariffs, and economic nationalism, tariffs, sanctions, technology transfers, cutting them off on technology transfers, that's what they want now for China. The question is it too late? Is any of this going to work? They were hoping that it would. So far, the evidence is that it has not worked. It has not worked. Is there any evidence that it will work in the future, considering that countries of the global south are lining up not behind the United States, but behind China and the BRICS group to become members because they see their future with them? They see economic and social development because China, by the way, doesn't offer just economic development for certain companies. Yes, it does that, but it also offers social development, infrastructural development. It offers schools and hospitals and parks and roads and housing. So the dimension here is not strictly I'm going to come in to Peru and invest just in the just for that port that I'm going to build. They take on other projects for economic and social development. Okay, they do the same thing in Africa, by the way, because the West is complaining that the global South is becoming too uh, financially dependent, borrowing from China to build programs, to build all kinds of projects, and becoming financial dependent on China. Financial dependence is something about which the West knows a lot about, by the way, because in the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, financial dependence is how the Western countries maintained economic dominance in the global South through loans, basically linked to trade and market share in individual countries in the global South. Now, I want to turn to another issue related to China, because a lot of people think, well, Trump is only interested in taking on China. Actually, he's not. That's why the title of this video session has the term world, China and the world. Trump is actually interested in taking on the world. Um, anyone in the world um, that he deems, that the U.S. deems is not facilitating economic growth of the United States is to be penalized. For example, Canada and Mexico are right next to the U.S. The U.S. is right between Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. Both of these countries are targeted by Trump. Both of them, Canada and Mexico, are targeted. I have to point out that both of these countries, Canada and Mexico, along with the United States, are part of the NAFTA agreement, okay? The North American Free Trade Agreement, okay? That's 3 decades old, over 3 decades old now. And yet, the Trump administration is targeting its neighbors. And they, of course, have announced that they plan to retaliate any way they can and defend themselves, defend their interests, their economic interests. Um, they will take them on every possible um, item of export, from aluminum to steel. Mexico, of course, is a unique case because Mexico has a rising economic relationship with China. It's a major trading partner with China. And China exports quite a bit to Mexico, and Mexico then re exports to the United States. The Trump people are onto that, and they want to punish Mexico for doing that sort of thing. The Trump administration has argued that it's interested in making sure that the United States maintains its technological superiority and independence. It wants to be self-sufficient in biotechnology. It doesn't want products coming in, biotech products and pharmaceutical products coming in from China. Um, so it's putting the brakes on not just on China, but any country that China indirectly deals with, and then they re-export to the United States. And Mexico and Canada are targeted. Besides Mexico and Canada, of course, there is Europe. The U.S. will go after the U.S. under Trump will also go after Europe. You can see, by the way, this is obviously my session is analytical and theoretical, but when you look at how the stock market and the dollar performed, let me put it this way, from the day after the election until today, look at the performance of the dollar, look at the performance of stock markets outside the U.S. They tell the whole story. The world is worried. They are worried that this administration coming in will be very aggressive toward them. So their markets declined. Okay. I can tell you specific countries. Germany is very concerned, especially with its auto industry facing competition, obviously from China with electric vehicles. People who study up on this know this already, but they are concerned about every domain from energy to electronics and automobiles. They are concerned. The reason for the dollar strengthening is not because the dollar is strong. The dollar is actually intrinsically weak. It's kept artificially strong. We'll talk more about that because Trump has plans for the dollar, weaponized even more. But the expectation is, and when you trade in currency, this is what you look for. By the way, the expectation is that the Trump economic war against the world is going to dilute the markets of the rest of the world, bring them down because of tariffs, punitive tariffs. So their currencies are going to be weaker, hence the strength of the dollar. Another mechanism to artificially strengthen the dollar. The dollar is not intrinsically strong. Dollar is not reflect. I mean, the dollar is not strong intrinsically, meaning we don't have any more capacity to reflect this rise in the dollar. Why is the dollar stronger all of a sudden? The Fed policy stays more or less steady. So how do you explain it? It was something like it went from what to the euro from 112.5 to down to 105 in just a few days because of Trump, because of the fear in the markets, the fear in the markets that Trump inculcated this fear in the markets. So the fact is that US tariff policy has a global impact on the economy. And this impacts, by the way, people's living standards. This impacts the products they buy because when you have a currency fluctuation of that magnitude, people pay more, right? Their currency devalued. When you buy products in and you have to pay your currency is worth less, you pay more at the store. So you see this has an impact in living standards, and he hasn't even taken office yet. The Trump team, it's not he, but the Trump team hasn't even taken office yet, and already you see the markets reacting globally out of fear of what will happen. And already you see products and services priced accordingly to reflect that change. And we'll have to wait, like I said, we'll have to wait and see what comes down. Now, the question of uh, uh, the ability of the United States to punish China and what China can do. Well, Trump has another card to play, the continued weaponization of the dollar. The United States does not want the dollar's value diminished, although the dollar it has been kept artificially high for decades. It is the world's most traded currency. It is used. It's true that it's used in by international financial institutions by financial institutions internationally to in money exchanges, and that in itself, it's used in trade, it's used in oil, trading oil. So that in itself is power for the dollar. However, there's a challenge coming, and it's not coming from the euro, by the way. It's coming from China and the BRICS group. Now, let's pause and reflect on this. How is it possible that an economy that's second in the world, namely the United States, in terms of purchasing power parity, not first, that's China, close to 35 trillion versus 28 trillion for the United States in purchasing power parity, PPP terms. How can the second, how can the world's second largest economy have the world's number one currency? For how long? Great Britain did. Yeah, the British pound held on, and then eventual demise. Now, one could argue, and rightly so, that Great Britain faced two world wars and a Great Depression in between them, right? World War One, Great Depression, World War Two, the end. And then the US had to step in with massive loans to bail them out. US is not in that position. However, there is a however. The US is in a very weak position, very weak position, because every year it spends more and more on defense. And every year he tries to find, and Trump will do this, by the way. He will, I am optimistic. I'm optimistic, as are a lot of people around the world, that he will bring a closure. He will try to bring diplomatic solution to the Ukraine war, and one hopes an end to the genocide war that Israel has been carrying out against the Palestinian people. And of course, there is talk about Lebanon already coming to an end even before Trump takes over. Um, However, he will put more money in defense because that's what he did the first time to compensate for um, the neo-isolationist policy, which is unilateralism, in other words. Doesn't want to get involved in expensive military campaigns, knowing he's not much will come out of it other than rising public debt. Regrettably, the Democrats never learned that very difficult lesson, it seems. Trump will, in fact, I think, go that route of diplomatic solutions with Russia. He has a history of that, and I think we can expect that. However, the budget of the Defense Department will continue to rise. The combined strength of China and Russia, given they have a very deep strategic relationship and economic relationship, is somewhat uh, threatening to the West. They will continue to look at it as menacing. The Trump will also continue the containment, militarism policy, and destabilization policy in the Middle East and in the South China Sea. So that's costly. At the same time, he will continue more corporate welfare programs, more subsidies. He's already announced massive deregulation to let energy companies drill everywhere they can. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see on that one. But the corporate welfare regime will continue, although it has not yielded the results they hoped for. Just take Intel. Look at where Intel was before the CHIPS Act, which is a corporate subsidy program that Biden announced before that, and look at it. Look where Intel is now. It's lost half its value, although the government poured billions into it, into subsidizing the chips and semiconductor sector. And what did it achieve all along? Nothing, because China moved ahead to become independent of the West, of the United States, and a Dutch company that makes the machines that make the semiconductors. So you have basically greater independence of China, You also have the reality we found out recently, by the way, that Taiwan Semiconductor, one of the world's premier chips company, that the U.S. was hoping was on its side, and it is, but it's also doing business in China. They believe in globalization. So all along, lo and behold, they were playing both sides. And we don't know, by the way, to what degree Korean and Japanese companies have been doing this. We do know that although Japan has been just as militant against Chinese geopolitical ambitions, especially with regard to the aggression, what they regard and the US regards aggression in Taiwan, and Chinese encroaching in the South China Sea. The fact is that China and Japan, and here's where the contradiction is, and this is why it is mind boggling to see where the Trump administration is going. The fact is that China and Japan have agreed to a multi trillion, not billion, trillion-dollar deal for the next decade. These are two of the Asian powerhouses. South Korea, the same thing, by the way. Taiwan, the same thing. All these countries, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, geopolitically allied with the United States, and I'll explain to you why I'm mentioning this. Geoeconomically linked to China. How long will it take before they break and geopolitically go with China? The reason I'm mentioning this is because in the 19th century, Spain geopolitically controlled, had dominance. I shouldn't say control, had dominance in Latin America, Caribbean, up until the Spanish American War. But economically, it was Western Europe and the United States that were dominant. And who won out? It was the Europeans, the West Europeans, the US that prevailed. So the economy really is the foundation for military power. The economy is the foundation for military power. China is not focused on becoming the world's number one military power. The US is maintaining that because that's all it has. China is focused on a single issue: maintaining the number one position in the world as the dominant economy and integrating as much of the world under its aegis. Now, they claim, obviously, you can't possibly take them seriously because they have national interests, and number one comes China and then the rest of the world for them. But they have been much, much kinder in terms of pursuing projects and programs that have mutual benefit, by the way, than the Western countries when you compare the neo-imperialist West in Africa. Let's take one example. France, in Niger, no longer there because they were kicked out by the military officers. They were buying uranium for about $5 a kilo when it was selling for 300 in the market, in the international market. Okay. You can look at the cocoa industry in the Ivory Coast. You can look at the mining industry in the Congo, right? So no matter what you look at, the terms of trade that China offers to the global South are better. They're better. And on top of that, they throw in some social development, some hostels, some schools, some roads, some parks along those lines. Whereas the West does not. The West goes in, especially the US goes in, and what do they offer? Usually military bases. What good will that do? You know? And of course, the fact is that the country, the host country, winds up paying for those, paying a dear price for those, because the U.S. under Trump will demand that every country from NATO to Canada, Canada has already complained about this, by the way. I just read a recent article. They will demand that countries allied with them raise their defense budgets and buy from the American defense industry, strengthen the American defense industry. You see, it's this sort of relationship, economic relationship of an uneven relationship, and a relationship based on threats and sanctions and tariffs and intimidation that should not surprise anyone. Why the US hasn't really made much progress when you look at the debt. In 2016, the first time that Trump got elected, it was half of what it is today, roughly half of what it is today. Why hasn't economic nationalism won? Um, hasn't achieved its goals? He said they would. He followed it. Biden followed it. After 8 years, the debt nearly doubled. How can this be possible? And on top of that, what are the American people? Are the American people better off? The fact is, the American people voted for, many of them voted for Trump. Obviously, he won the presidency. Most of them voted for Trump because they were disenchanted with an administration that they were hoping would become more democratic, but it wasn't. It clamped down on free speech, by the way, across college campuses, especially. It clamped down on anti-war demonstrators. It did not. It did not give, as Senator Bernie Sanders stressed, the working class the social benefits, the living wage that they needed so that they can support the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States. Senator Sanders was absolutely correct. Exactly what did the Biden administration do other than a war in Ukraine, a proxy war in Ukraine? We won't debate the merits of that, different issue. And this genocide war in Israel. Toward what end? So that a handful of companies can raise their bank accounts, can have more money in their bank accounts? How does this benefit the national economy? And then on top of that, placing 100% tariff on electric vehicles from China. Trump said 200%. Raise that to 200%. You can go 1,000%. The Chinese haven't sold and don't intend to use the. They don't. They'll rely on the rest of the world market, by the way, to sell electric vehicles. It doesn't matter. That's nonsense. But when you look honestly, when you look at the bottom line, what you find is the bottom line is the inability to compete. The fact is that in every field, from aerospace to biotech to artificial intelligence to semiconductors to quantum computing, in every field, what you find is that China has leaped way ahead from high speed trains to unbelievably high, major mega bridges and tunnels through the Himalayan mountains. The projects, like reforestation of deserts, um, unbelievable projects in every domain, in every domain. And the question is, how is the US and the West meeting this challenge? Trying to stop this, trying to stop it, instead of competing, which is what the neoliberal theoretical model calls for: competition, weaponizing the dollar, weaponizing trade, weaponizing the partners, the trading partners, to impose punitive measures on the enemy that the U.S. is rival, namely China, isn't going to achieve any goal. It isn't going to achieve any goal. And what we have is, unfortunately, a working class that's going to be left even poorer after Trump leaves office in 4 years. Because if the United States pursues all that it's promising under Trump, there will be a decline in consumption because prices will rise. Because what happens when a country imposes tariffs on, let's say, laptops, okay? It's a subsidy on the domestic producer of those laptops because they raise the price. So it's not that the consumer is paying less for the domestic product. Consumer is paying more because the consumer knows that the import is more expensive. So they're going to raise the price to bring it closer to that price of the product. So consumption goes down. So we will have to wait and see, but there are also geopolitical ramifications of this. And this is the last thing I'm going to cover because we're almost up on the hour. Economic nationalism breeds militarism. The United States, as the great William Eppermel Williams, the American historian from the University of Wisconsin back in the 60s, during the Vietnam War, argued the United States has been an empire, and empire was a way of life for the United States. Now it seems Cold War is a way of life for the United States. They can't seem to shake off the Cold War, although it has been detrimental. Containment militarism has been detrimental because the defense sector absorbs enormous resources from the civilian economy that are precious resources needed for the civilian economy, and not just economic development, but social development. So what we have here is continued downward trend in social mobility for the United States and rising debt, not just public debt, but private debt. So this is alarming because this leads governments to adopt more police state approaches to governing and authoritarian measures in order to control their population. So this leads to a dilution of democracy. And this is one of the most important things to keep in mind, that democracy itself will suffer with the rise of economic nationalism concurrently with the rise of militarism. And so domestic freedoms guaranteed by the US Constitution and a democratic open society that people have come to expect will wither away and give way to authoritarianism. According to the Pew Research Center, the majority of the United States, the majority of the United States population expects the country to be more authoritarian. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to thank you for tuning in, and I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much.